we're going to have NAFSCI, the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement, come up and tell us about the exciting market research that they're doing. I'm going to introduce Vito Borrello, who is a close colleague and a dear friend, who is the founding executive director of our new National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement, to fill in a gap that just was never there so that we can have a real field of family engagement. NAFSCI's mission is to advance high impact policy and practice of family engagement and children's development, to improve children's development and academic achievement all the way from birth through career, aiming toward a world where family engagement is universally recognized as an essential strategy for improving our schools and helping all our children thrive. So Vito, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you will introduce the Frameworks team. This is going to be a very exciting interactive session. So how can we talk about this work in ways that really gets people buying in to the value of it, rather than saying things like, well, why should schools have to engage families? That's what families should do, and schools should just, be caring when the kids get there, and then nobody has to do all this extra work. Vito, are you going to go up there? Or why don't you just stay? Yeah, whatever.
So what Ann didn't say is she's actually the co-founder of NAFSCI. So I may be the founding executive director, but she was here far long before I was, 3 years in the making. And Ann, we're not new anymore. We were 5 years old in September. So we're in kindergarten. We have entered, we're school aged and continuing to grow. Let me just say, it is a pleasure to be here. I was here 2 years ago. I want to say to the day. I had it in my mind that it was December 10th, 2 years ago. And I remember the room was just as full. We were in the exact same room at the exact same place, just staying in a different hotel. But other than that, everything else seems to be the same. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here. I wanna just start by letting you know this has become a labor of love for me because I've been in this work for 25 years. When I had the opportunity to come to NAFSCI and Ann said you can commute, which was kind of a big deal to me. Although I'm now in the office more than I'm at home, but that's okay, and every place else. This has just been a labor of love and an incredible privilege to work with my colleagues in the field, particularly people like Patty and Donna and Judy and Jackie Coleman. So many people there in this room that I work with, I feel like every day. You're very, very blessed to have some gems in this work, both from a passion perspective and as practitioners here in Connecticut. I also want to just thank a few people, speaking to that. First of all, I want to thank Charlene, who is always so supportive of this work and allows Judy, I think, and all of us that are doing this work to thrive. So thank you, Charlene. Yeah. I've gotten to know Charlene through our CCSSO State Consortium, and she's just a pleasure and brilliant as well. Judy, of course, everybody knows, and she was one of our first founding members of NAFSCI, and as we were just getting this thing off the ground, Judy was there with us, figuring it all out and helping us to grow as infants. Betsy Labarius, who I've known also, I feel like since early on, and now they have the SFEC here in Connecticut, one of 12 states in the country, and since she's doing great work. And the philanthropists that are in this room, that's what makes Connecticut special. The philanthropists in this community, in this state, have taken a leadership role. So people like Carol O'Donnell and Jackie Coleman and Richard Schlussman, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, they've supported a variety of efforts, not here only in the state, but even in NAFSCI's growth as well. So we're thankful to have the philanthropy leadership here, and hopefully you are as well, because this probably wouldn't be here, right, Judy? If it wasn't for the philanthropists taking a leadership role. And then I already mentioned Patty and Donna from NPLI. They're part of our, you were lucky. You have this National Parent Leadership Institute, NPLI, here in Connecticut, in your home state, and they're now in did you say 17 states now? It's awesome. NAFSC's mission is to advance policy, high impact policy and practice to promote child development, student achievement, and school improvement. But really, the key words are really about around advancing policy and practice, and that's why we're here today. Oh, perfect. Thank you, thank you. Okay, and I want to speak to our vision. And there are a couple of key phrases here that I think are really, really important because it's where we maybe aren't yet, but where we want to go, and that's what a vision is all about. So first, that family engagement is universally practiced. As an essential strategy. So those are those two key phrases. Universally practiced, which we know that isn't necessarily the case in education. So often it's public relations and not necessarily about how are we leveraging partnerships with families who have expertise on their children, no matter their socioeconomic status, where they live, or their education level. Parents have expertise on their children, and educators need to leverage that. And that's where that essential strategy is for improving children's learning. And then the last phrase, really important to us, advancing equity. This is about family engagement for all, but it is also about family engagement in a way that closes the achievement gap. So we have to make sure that everything that we're doing is around equitable policy and practice in a way that there is access and opportunity for all. Okay. Oh, wrong way. There we are. So we are a professional membership association, and as Ann knows, and we both kind of do this, I shamelessly promote joining NAFSC because this is about a movement, and it is about numbers, and it is about influence. And this is the first time there has ever been an association whose sole focus was advancing policy and practice in this work. Not one of 7 priorities, but whose sole focus is advancing policy and practice in this work. And for us to do that, we need you. So I encourage you to consider, if you're not a member of NAFSC, consider joining. It's not expensive. There are organizational memberships. There are individual memberships. My director of communications, Lisa Aramoni, just texted me to say anyone who joins this week from this convening will receive a 25% discount. So you just have to go on nafsc.org. And there'll be a membership button, and you just simply type in NAFSC 2019. In addition to being a professional membership association, our association is about tackling the strategic obstacles to this work, because we know that even though we all have this great vision for where we want to be, until we address some of the key obstacles for the work, we're challenged to achieve that vision. So I want to talk about 4 of these key obstacles that we're currently working on. The first one is building state capacity. So I think many of you know that Connecticut is one of 18 states. They were actually in the first cohort. And actually, we're actually getting this off the ground before the cohort even started, right? I mean, Judy was working on this a year before the CCSSO State Consortium for Family Engagement even started. And CCSSO stands for the Council of Chief State School Officers. That is actually the association for all of the state education department commissioners across the country. So this is significant, and we became a partner early on with them, because it's one thing for NAFSC. I mean, we're drinking the Kool-Aid. All of us in this room are drinking the Kool-Aid. We need to get the broad-based education organizations to be thinking the way we are, to understand family engagement, and to know what the opportunities are for advancing student achievement and school improvement when we're leveraging the expertise of families. So CCSSO taking this on was very, very significant, because I can tell you that before we started this project, I wouldn't suggest to you that there was even one state education department commissioner who I would really consider to be a true champion. Not that they're kind of supporting the work passively, but a true champion for this work. And that is not the case anymore. There are a handful of state education department commissioners who I would suggest to you are actually champions for our work. So I think that's real progress. And those 18 states have or are developing birth through grade 12 family engagement frameworks, strategic plans, roadmaps for their state. So that's really significant, because that goes to family engagement being an essential strategy. The next item I want to talk about, recognizing and building the capacity of the field. So we're in the process of creating a credentialing initiative. We want to create, for all practitioners in the field, a purposeful pathway to capacity. And then we want to recognize that capacity, because we know that even those people who are experts in this field aren't often recognized for it, or are in middle management positions when they should be heading offices. So this is something that we are really intentional about doing. In fact, I'm reviewing a body of knowledge that we're creating that we will then hope, because how do you create a credentialing program if you don't know what the standards are? And what are those endorsed standards? Well, there really aren't endorsed standards. So we're in the process of creating that, and we're going to be vetting that through to the field and engaging many of you in this effort. Third, preparing future educators and administrators. We're in the process of creating a pre-service higher education consortium for family engagement. And in fact, preparing to select 6 or 7 state teams who will work with the NEA, NAFSCE, the American Association for Colleges for Teaching Education, and CAPE, the Educator Preparation Accreditation Agency, to develop a pre-service framework so that teachers are prepared to engage families before they enter the classroom, which we believe is the root cause to so many of the challenges in our work, is teachers aren't prepared to engage families before they enter the classroom. It's why there's 70% of our teachers feel they have an unsatisfactory relationship with families. It's why teachers have a negative disposition toward families, not because they don't like them, not because they're bad people, because they care. It's because they're not prepared to be successful in those relationships. And when we're not successful, we're not prepared to be successful, we don't deal with an issue until when? When we have to. And when we have to is probably when there's a crisis. And we haven't built relational trust. And so we're positioned to, teachers are then positioned to fail from my perspective, because they haven't been prepared. So that's a really significant initiative for us. And then lastly, what we hear about today, reframing the conversation around family engagement. We've worked with the Frameworks Institute for 3 years. We started this in 2016, Marisa, and this was the first convening that we came to 2 years ago after our initial research with this work. And then in July, and you'll hear all about this, the Frameworks Institute came out with their recommendations, what we call the message memo, around how do we communicate family engagement. And what we found is, and what you're going to hear about, is that there are these gaps from what do the experts, how do they communicate it and understand it? How do policymakers understand it? How do practitioners understand it? And how does the general public understand it? And all of them understand it in a different way. And the goal here is, how do we get the general public? Because that, at the end of the day, is what, we're all drinking the Kool-Aid, but we need the general public to understand family engagement the way that we do. And that we need to be intentional and strategic to do that. So that's what you're going to hear about today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shaun Adamic and Marisa Gerstein Pineau. Shaun actually started with us as the program officer for the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and funded the research for this particular project. And he has been a master communicator and a campaign manager for much of his career. He has managed campaigns from the mayoral level to the gubernatorial campaign for, I believe, Governor O'Malley, to a presidential campaign when Governor O'Malley in Maryland was running for president. And has also been involved in a variety of reframing initiatives, including global warming, hunger, juvenile justice, and now family engagement. And then secondly, I want to introduce Marisa Gerstein Pineau, who you met 2 years ago. She's a sociologist with the Frameworks Institute. She's been there for 4 years. And she has worked on things like, and currently, developmental relationships, reframing adolescence, and poverty in the UK. So without further ado, let me introduce Shaun.
Okay, thanks, Vito. So I'm no longer a funder. I'm a recovering funder. So no one hit me up for grants. Okay, so today we're gonna heed the call to actually do some things today, not just talk about them. So get ready. We're going to do some practice. Ultimately, today we're going to talk about how our culture shapes our worldview. You're going to walk out of here having a better understanding of how our worldview determines perceptions. We're going to practice how framing can change our understanding, particularly our public's understanding about public engagement, and then how, importantly, we can craft more effective messages. Ready? Okay, let's start with a game. The game is called Have I Ever? Find a partner. Everybody pair up, find a partner. Okay, everyone have a partner? All right, here's the game. When I figure out who alphabetically has the first name alphabetically first in your group, you're going to go first. Figure out who that is in your pair. Okay, raise your hand if that's you. All right, you're going to go first. When I click the slide, this sentence is going to be completed. It is going to say, have I ever, let's say, baked a cake, just as an example. Have I ever baked a cake, okay? For those of you going first, who just raised your hand, you are going to turn to your partner and say, with your best poker face, have I ever baked a cake? Or you're actually going to read what's up here. But as an example, have I ever baked a cake? You're going to, with your best poker face, say that to your partner. Your partner's job is to answer the question about you. Okay? So, your name? Crystal. If Crystal and I were a pair, and I were going first, I would turn to Crystal and say, have I ever baked a cake? Or whatever it is that says on this slide, okay? And Crystal's job is to guess whether I've ever done whatever it says up here, okay? Everybody get what we're doing? Okay? This is going to be a quick thing, all right? We want instinctive answers. Ready? Set. Go.
Have I ever?
Use this one. Use this one. Okay, now we're going to switch. Different prompt. Different prompt. Ready? So the person who just asked the question is now going to answer the question. The person who answered is now going to ask the question. Ready? Set. Go.
Have I ever been
I like looking at the body language on this one. I saw someone go like this, like, that's all right, just a little bit. That was arrested. What we have done together is played a game of mindsets, essentially, what we call cultural models. When you were asked, have I ever played ice hockey, your brain in that moment was accessing shortcuts that you have about hockey, right? About the sport itself, about what it looks like, about what it takes to perform that task, and about the kind of person that might do that, right? And you did the same thing when you were answering the question about having been arrested. What kind of people are arrested? Is that kind of person reflected in my partner, right? What we do to make sense of the world as human beings is create these shortcuts all the time. And these shortcuts are based on lots of things. They're based on our family, they're based on our lived experience, they're based on the media, they're based on our culture, they're based on the context that we live in. No one starts from a blank slate on anything. So as advocates, when we're talking about family engagement, even if our audiences have never heard those words before, or never heard that term before, have no concept of family engagement, they have already formed a mindset around it. Because they know what a family is, they have an idea of what engagement is, and whether they're right or wrong, that's where they start. And so what the Frameworks Institute does is map that thinking I'm not a researcher. Marisa's the researcher in the room. She's going to walk through exactly what the research showed, but I'm a communicator. I help organizations and advocates talk about themselves and their missions and why they matter. And so, in this case, what Frameworks has done is mapped the public dialogue on how people think and talk about family engagement, and how that might be problematic for you all as advocates for family engagement. And importantly, how we can then help shape that public dialogue, help navigate around those minefields that exist in people's minds because they hold an existing mindset about, in this case, family engagement, and about ice hockey, and about being arrested. We can shape those cultural models through a thing called framing. And very simply, framing is the lens through which a story is told, the lens through which a narrative is told. We do this because if we can change communication, we can change the way we, everybody in this room, talks about family engagement, then we can change discourse. If we change the way we talk about family engagement, we can change the way our public talks to each other about family engagement. And if we can do that, then we can shape their thinking, retool how they think about family engagement. And that is the foundation for changing policy around family engagement. You can't get to the end of this continuum unless you do the beginning. You can't change public policy without first changing thinking around the issue, changing the way people talk to each other on the issue, and it starts with how we talk about the issue. In addition to being a recovering funder, as Vito mentioned, I'm also a recovering political operative. And let me tell you, we wrote the book on non-engagement, right? We wrote the book, we used to hold taxpayer night at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday because we didn't want anybody to show up, right? And so we got really good at changing public policy without engagement. And what happens? It doesn't last, right? Because eventually the public figures you out. And so what we're talking about here is long-term policy change, long-term behavioral change, and long-term discourse change, long-term conversation change. And if we're good at it, if we develop frames that work, then we can shift knowledge, but not just knowledge, not just what people know about family engagement or the types of, the forms family engagement can take. That's important, but that's not enough. We also want to change attitudes, how people feel about family engagement. And then that is the basis for shifting support for policies around family engagement. So here's an example, using the example around arts education. If we're good at this, and we can develop the frames, the right frames, the ones that quote unquote work, arts education benefits kids, schools, and communities in ways that benefit everyone, right? If I'm an advocate for arts education, it's important that my public knows just that that's a thing that works, that there is a connection between arts education and student learning, right? But that's not enough. We also want to shift attitudes. Everyone should have access to high-quality arts education. And then we want to shift policy support. Investment in arts education should be a priority for our district now and in the future. So our job as advocates is not just information sharing. It's not just spreading the word about what engagement can look like. It is fundamental, that's knowledge, right? That's at the top of this list. It is fundamentally shifting attitudes and then policy support. So our goal is not to persuade people to agree with us. It is to help them access more productive ways of thinking about family engagement. As advocates in any space, and I work across dozens of issues, as advocates in any space, it is our instinct to figure out the people who disagree with us and convince them they're wrong. And I am here to tell you that is a fool's errand. The brain research, the cultural research that the Frameworks Institute does proves, and we'll go through some of this today, proves that You are talking in circles if that is your goal. Instead, our goal is to help people access more productive ways of thinking that actually already exist in their brains, right? We just have to give them the off-ramp to it. We just have to help them access those more productive ways of thinking. But first, we have to identify the really unproductive ways of thinking. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We all have a problem. The problem is that what we say as advocates is not the same thing as what our public thinks. And here's an example. It has nothing to do with, well, maybe it does, have a lot to do with family engagement. This is not in the engagement space, this is about criminal justice. Okay, this came from another study that the Frameworks Institute does. But I want to use it to demonstrate the gap between what experts and advocates say and what the public thinks. Okay? So on the left, you see probably a pretty familiar message, right? If any of you are involved in criminal justice or juvenile justice, or even if you're not, you already have a mindset around juvenile justice and criminal justice, right? And so a pretty typical message from an expert or advocate would be, improving the criminal justice system is about supporting individuals and meeting needs so that people can have stable lives and make better decisions. Make sense? Here's, on the right, the public mindset around criminal justice.
If people knew like a harsh truth or a harsh type of punishment that would happen if you did this, we would have less crime.
Punishments should be a little bit more harsh.
If your crime's bad enough, I don't think you should just allow people just to get away with that.
If you're chasing someone on the freeway, you should be able to shoot them. People would mess with that. They were carrying your gun.
I like to see more public displays of law. Back in the West, you get hung in front of the whole town. It was different.
Okay, so what do we hear? Punitive? What else? Lack of education? What did we hear? What are some assumptions? What are some, we'll get into this phrase, cultural models? What are the mindsets that were displayed on the right here?
People deserve what they get.
Deserving, right? Exactly, they deserve what they get. So, therefore, if that is my cultural model around justice, criminal justice, then everybody that's been punished must have deserved it, right? What else? What else did we hear?
Rational decisions.
Rational decisions. Explain.
The person who is committing a crime is looking at the profit margin on their activity and making a judgment.
That's right. It's the classic, death penalty for drug kingpins, as if drug kingpins don't live with the prospect of death every day of their lives. The idea that crime is a result solely of individual behavior and individual choices. What else? What else do we hear?
No thought of
deterrent.
no redemption.
No redemption. What else?
No thought of what brought a person to that situation that they made that decision.
Well, there's some thought of what brought it, but it's a very limited understanding of what brought it. What is the limited understanding of what brought those behaviors? Individual behavior, right? Individual decision making. So what's left out? The system, right? Context. So, what's on the left is not the same thing as what's on the right. And what the research shows is that we can scream the message on the left as loud as we want. But if the attitudes and assumptions on the right are what drives dominant thinking, then we will cognitively, people cannot get from the left to the right. Their brains can't get there unless we give them an off-ramp, unless we give them access to more productive ways of thinking. So, we're taught as communicators to meet people where they are. We're taught to resonate our messages. We want our messages to resonate. The problem is, I just showed you where people are. It's in a super toxic place. It's a really unproductive place. And so our job is not just to meet people where they are, because if we meet people where they are and only meet people where they are, then we give them license to stay there. We give them license to stay in their really toxic, unproductive ways of thinking. Instead, we want to resonate, we want to meet people where they are, and then move them to a more productive place. So not just resonate, but resonate in the right direction. In the direction that's going to make them more likely to shift their attitudes on family engagement and support the policies that we advocate for. And we do that through framing. A couple of rules, a couple of assumptions that are important to note here. First, framing is not a script. Our job here is not to give you a script to keep in your pocket and every time you want to talk about family engagement, pull it out and read it. That's not our job here, okay? If that's the case, this could have been a shorter session, right? We could have just passed that out and say have a good day. Framing is not a script. It is meant to be adapted for audience. You will not hear us talk really specifically about audiences today. You will not hear us talk about tailoring each message to each audience. Frankly, as a professional communicator, I think we overdo that in my field. But regardless, of course, audiences need different messages. But the frames, the lens, the filter through which those messages go is going to stay pretty consistent, regardless of audience. We're going to talk at that level today. Okay, so messages are meant to be adapted. We're going to talk about the lens, the frame, the filter for the message. And it is meant to open new doors for consideration, right? We are not giving you the golden nugget that is going to immediately open the door immediately change people's thinking around family engagement. What the framing research is designed to do, what the recommendations we're going to walk through are designed to do, is to help people just open that little door in their heads, right? To get them to consider the problem a little differently, and therefore the solutions that we all offer a little differently. And so we're going to talk about shifting that public narrative. And shifting a public narrative isn't quick. It's not a campaign, right? It's not a single campaign. When I was in politics, our job was short-term behavior change, right? Our job was to get you to the first Tuesday in November, and then I didn't really care what you thought after that, right? I either wanted you to walk into the polling booth and do what I wanted you to do, and if you weren't inclined to do that, I didn't want you to walk into the polling booth at all, right? That was my job. That is not our job here. Our job is about long-term behavior change, long-term fundamental shift in thinking, in considering an issue. It's a different strategy, so it isn't quick. It's a long-term marathon. It also isn't once. It's not enough just to change the way you talk about family engagement in an op-ed or in an editorial. It is about fundamentally shifting the way you talk about it. So I would encourage you today, when we're done with this work and you are grounded in this work, to go home, go back to your office tomorrow morning and look at something you've produced, a speech, an op-ed, a letter to the editor, a letter to parents, whatever it is. Look at something you've produced that focuses around, that talks about family engagement, and commit yourself to be willing at least to change it. At the very least, be willing to consider that some of the stuff you might be producing may be triggering really unproductive ways of thinking about family engagement. So commit yourself to at least that possibility. Because doing this once isn't enough. You have to fundamentally change long-term the way you talk about family engagement. It isn't alone. It's not enough for half of this room to shift the way they talk about family engagement. It's not even enough for this entire room to shift the way they talk about family engagement. It can start with us, and if we do it consistently, over time, then we can get our audiences and our colleagues and our partners to talk to each other differently about family engagement. It isn't a script. Again, this isn't about memorizing a line or memorizing a paragraph. And lastly, it isn't blind. This is not stuff that we wrote because we're good writers. This is not stuff that we wrote because we're good marketers. This is research-based. This is evidence-based. And Marisa, who has a lot more letters after her name than I do, is going to walk you through the evidence and the recommendations that came out of that evidence. And this is what the research looks like. Now, I'm not smart enough to understand any of this. But it is just a demonstration to you that this was not a poll test, right? This was not, we didn't call up 500 of your friends and ask them to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on messaging that we created. That's garbage. And frankly, it's what permeates too much of my field, where we spend a lot of money to really quickly understand what the public thinks about an issue and how they talk about an issue for only the purpose of us spitting it back at them, right? And if all we're doing is meeting people where they are, we're giving them license to stay there. So this is methodologically sound, rock solid research. That included, importantly, about 5,300 participants in different formats. So how do we shift the public narrative? First, we have to map the terrain. That's what the research did. The bulk of our time together is going to be spent on that. Then we need to develop a strategy on how to navigate around that terrain. That's also what the research did. And then we need to mobilize others, and that's your job. So, let's start with mapping the terrain. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's what the bulk of our session is. But this is ultimately the terrain. These are, for the most part, the really unproductive cultural models, and I'll explain that term in a second, around family engagement. This is how the public thinks and talks about family engagement. So I'll just pick out a couple of them. First, crisis management, right? You heard that earlier, that the only time it's appropriate to engage with my child's school is when my child is in crisis, when he's in trouble, or I say he because I have 3 boys. When the teacher calls and says there's a real problem, that's when engagement happens. Another one is around compartmentalized learning, and this comes out in the engagement research. It also comes out in the education research, which is that learning happens in buckets, right? I do math, and then I do English, and then I do social studies, and then, right? And of course, we know anybody that's has read anything about child development in the last 20 years knows that that's actually not how the brain works, that it's all integrated. But there's a nugget here at the bottom, you notice it's a different color, that can actually work in our favor. The public largely thinks of schools as families. Well, as advocates for family engagement, we can work with that, right? So, again, our job isn't just to meet people where they are. Our job isn't just to resonate our messages. It's to resonate in the right direction. And so there's a direction that we can work with. We'll get into that more deeply. So these cultural models, what I just gave you are examples of cultural models. Okay, we're going to use that term a lot today. So I want to get you grounded on what it means. Cultural models are assumptions and beliefs that are created through years of experience and expectation. And we have cultural models, I say we because we're all part of this culture too, right? We have cultural models literally around everything. If I were to give a talk right now around nuclear physics, do we have any experts in nuclear physics in the room? No, okay? But you've all just formed a cultural model. You have it, you are accessing right now a cultural model that you have around nuclear physics. And you formed an opinion already about that talk, right? And yet know nothing about nuclear physics, and neither do I, so I'm not going to give that talk. Cultural models are relied on to interpret, organize, and make meaning of experiences. These are the shortcuts in our brains that we made around playing ice hockey, around being arrested. And they structure thinking about information. So even as I give data and statistics and numbers to convince you that your cultural model is wrong, what the research shows is you're still accessing that cultural model and actually digging in deeper. In fact, there are a number of studies that show that as we confront unproductive, toxic cultural models with data, solely with data, then what our public starts to do is question the source of the data, the accuracy of the data, instead of convincing themselves that they're wrong. So cultural models are widely shared. They are taken for granted and they are largely automatic, right? They happen in an instant, and most of the time you don't know it's happening. Your brain does it, right? Automatically. They are highly durable. They're really hard to break through, which is why, again, our job is not to convince people that their cultural models are wrong. It is instead to help them access more productive ones that they also hold. Because the wonderful complexity of our human brains is that we can hold conflicting values in our heads at the same time. And so our job is to help access the more productive ones. There are more than one cultural models around issues, and they often conflict. Again, we can hold conflicting values and ideas in our heads at the same time. I can believe in rugged individualism, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? I can believe that to my core, and I can believe in the power of strong networks. And we get by with a little help from our friends, right? I can believe those two things at the same time. One of those models is going to drive my dominant thinking around, insert issue here, right? Around criminal justice, around education, around child development, whatever. And one of them is going to be more recessive, but it's still there. So our job as communicators is to help people access those more recessive but productive cultural models. They are activated by associated information, and this is where, we're going to get into this more deeply, this is where the idea of metaphors comes in. When you introduce something that people can associate, because they have a cultural model around that thing too, and then link that metaphor with family engagement. We'll give you some examples. We'll give you an example. And they underlie public narratives. Cultural models shape public narrative, the story that we as a culture tell ourselves and each other about, in this case, family engagement. So let's talk about public narrative. When you accessed that cultural model about being arrested, right, in the game that we played, you didn't know it, but you started to do this. Answer these 5 questions. When people are confronted with an issue, with a concept, with an idea, and especially when they engage in conversations, they don't have to, because ultimately we're in conversation with ourselves and tell ourselves stories about issues as well. It's these 5 questions that they're accessing. First, who's involved? Who are the characters in this play, right? What's the goal? So what's the purpose of family engagement, right? What's the goal? How does it work? So like, what does it look like? How can I insert myself in it? Where can I find myself in family engagement? Why isn't it working? So not just what's broken about it, but who can I blame? And then how should it work, right? What's the idea? So let's go through some of these. And this is direct from the research. This is mapping the terrain.
What would you say are some of the most important things like that influence how kids learn?
It depends on the teacher.
The teacher?
Teachers can talk to parents.
Everything, a lot, really depends on what the parents are doing and not doing.
Their parents or other important people in their lives.
Mostly, it starts from the parents.
Typically, it's going to be the parents and then teachers at school.
The parents and the teachers and the children.
Okay, so what do we hear? Parents, teachers, children, right? It's what the Frameworks Institute calls the tangible triad. When I say education system, when I say school, when I say education, the public largely imagines teachers, parents, and kids. That's it. Now, as advocates for robust community, family, school engagement, why is that problematic for you? Only part of the picture. Who does it leave out? The community, right? Policymakers, right? Organizational leaders, right? Mentors. All of them are given a pass. Because if we see the system as just these 3 things, and we see the system as fundamentally broken, which, newsflash, we do. The public sees education as fundamentally broken. If those 2 things are true, then how do we fix the broken system? We fix one of these 3 things, right? We need to get better teachers, right? We need parents that care more. Or kids need to change their own behavior, right? And so if you look at the history of education reform in this country, the burden of changing it has shifted from one of these to the other over the last 100 years, right? We go through a phase of blaming parents, right? Education starts at home, and then we get over that, and then we go through a phase of blaming rotten kids, right? And then we get over that, and then we go back to the parents, right? And currently, we're on the phase of the burden of education reform falling squarely on the shoulders of teachers. And the reason that's true is because our public can't get out of the idea that the system is something more than these three things. And so our job, as advocates for a bigger system, to draw that bigger picture, is to actually draw it for our public, right? To show them all of the different players in the system that are outside of these three things. Okay, what's the goal of family engagement?
What role would you say schools have in a child's learning?
Well, for the sort of standard things that children learn, schools are really, really important.
Some of the foundational skills, math, reading, comprehension.
Math, reading. Schools do a great job of providing the core essentials. What about family? What role would you say family plays in kids' learning?
I mean, I feel like that's a lot different from classroom learning.
I think that's more maybe emotional learning as opposed to book learning.
Your family teaches you, I think, your morals.
For a school, it's more of, you know, like I said, how to learn, but that doesn't necessarily instill values in a child. That's where the parents come in.
Okay, what did we hear about the goal of family engagement?
It's kind of divided amongst different.
What's the divide? What's the divide?
Schools are responsible for the academic and how to learn. Parents are responsible for the morals and ethics of children.
As if they don't matter to each other, right? There's this divide. I send my kid off to learn math. He comes back, and I'll complete the picture, right? As a family, I'll make him into a good kid, right? But he's going to learn the book stuff somewhere else. And I don't want that teacher, or at the very least, I don't expect that teacher to be doing the job of a parent, and the parent doesn't, and the teacher doesn't expect the parent to be doing the job of the teacher, right? So the goal is divided. The goal of schools is academic, and the goal of families is to develop social and emotional skills. Now, why is that problematic? Because the whole basis of your work is that they're the same things, right? They have to be connected. They have to be interdependent, right? Otherwise, this engagement thing, it doesn't work. Conceptually, it doesn't work if these things aren't connected in our public's brains. And what the research shows is that they are not in our public's brains. And so our job as communicators is to do that for them. Make sure we make that connection. And that's, we're gonna talk about how to do that. Okay, how does family engagement work?
Loving teachers.
Have love in their heart.
Being loved and cared for.
Parents taking more interest in their children.
Just encouraging of education.
So like if your parents don't care, then you probably won't care that much either.
Okay, how does it work? What does it take? True love, right? In our country, what is a good teacher? One who cares, loves, right? Not one with a degree, not one with experience, not one that can lead a classroom, not one who can, with academic background, just one who loves and cares. And so therefore, good teachers are ones who love and care, and bad teachers are ones who don't, right? So, well, right, they're not there for social emotional anyway. So how does it work? Caring teachers and caring parents. As our public thinks about and conceptualizes family engagement, if they regard teachers, good teachers, as ones who care, they also regard parents as good parents in this context as ones who care. So if a parent is not engaging in their child's school, then they must not care, right? And if that's the case, then who does the onus of the problem go to? Them, right? The individual, either the teacher that's not caring the parent that's not caring, or both. If we as advocates are advocating around systemic change, around policy change, right? Then why is that problematic? Why would I support policy change if it's just that guy's problem, right? They just need to change their behavior. Why isn't it working?
I don't know, it's so hard because some families just like don't get involved with learning.
I feel like that all depends on what community that you live in. Because some communities are bad, some are good.
And the suburban families have a tendency to be more involved in the school process than in the city.
Okay, what's the problem? Why isn't it working?
Where you live.
Depends on where you live, right? Some neighborhoods are good, some neighborhoods are bad. This super, like, you know, you're either condemned to a certain future or you're not, right? Depending on, and what are the assumptions around this, right? How do we fix it? We don't, right? Because these things are determined by things outside of our control. And then finally, so parents don't, why isn't it working? Well, it isn't working because parents don't care or they're just bad communities. So finally, how should it work?
How do you think they should engage with each other, schools and families?
Think of like parent-teacher conferences.
PTA, Parent Teacher Association.
Parent-teacher conference. What about schools and communities working together? How would you say they engage each other?
You know, I feel like I don't have a lot of knowledge about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm really not sure on that one.
I wouldn't know tell you where to begin on that one.
I don't know, I've never really thought of them about working together. I've always thought about them separately.
Nothing really comes to mind for that.
I don't think community plays any role there.
So if you take the totality of all these things that are shaping public narrative up top, and we expect our public to have a different understanding of what family engagement can be, what did we just see? They can't, right? They can't conceptualize it because of all of this that comes first. So how should it work? Well, traditional engagement, right? Parent-teacher conferences, because again, that's my cultural model, right? That's my lived experience. That's my sole understanding of public engagement. And beyond that, schools and community working together, I can get there. And so, again, as advocates for wanting the public to think differently, more expansive, right, about family engagement, why is this problematic? Yeah, they can't imagine it existing, right? They can't get there from here. So again, this is this map of family engagement, how the public regards family engagement. These are the traps of public thinking, right? The tangible triad, teachers, parents, and students. That caring is everything. Love in their hearts. As long as they care, then they're successful, they're good, right, in my mind. Traditional engagement, parent-teacher conferences. Compartmentalized learning. I don't really know how the two would work together, right? These are all quotes that you heard in those videos. The culture of poverty, right? Some communities are good, some are bad, and I've got some assumptions about the bad ones. And then narrow benefits, right? I don't know how the community would play a role. So let's look at an example pulled from teacher.com, right? Pulled right off of the public website. Great teachers care about their students. They want them to succeed and are committed to helping them achieve their goals. Moreover, teachers care about their students' happiness, well-being, and life beyond their classroom. A great teacher does not make it a secret that they care, go the extra mile. Motivating students by encouraging them, rewarding them, and getting them involved shows your students, their teacher is vested in their education. Do the best job you can to teach your students, and they will notice. Meet with parents during conferences and school functions, send notes home about student performance, ask how things are outside the classroom, make a student feel as if their life is not just their homework, grades, and attendance is of interest to you. This is probably a familiar message, right? It doesn't seem all that wrong. What I'd like you to do is consider these traps in public thinking, and for a couple of minutes at your table, identify which ones you see in this short message from the internet. Ready, set, go. All right, what do we find? Certainly no sense that the system around the student is bigger than that, right? Okay, what else? Caring?
Someone said it.
Caring is everything. Point it out. Yeah, and again, what's important to note is nothing here is inaccurate, right? Nothing here is fundamentally wrong. And that's what is so challenging about this work, right? This doesn't need to be just deleted, right? It just needs to be reframed. It just needs to be tweaked. What else did we find? Yes?
The traditional, towards like conferences,
meet with parents during conferences and school functions, right? Very traditional education, very traditional engagement. Yes?
The narrow benefits of just asking about what's happening outside of the classroom.
Yeah, just ask about it, right? As long as they know, you care. So you can see how this stuff can surface pretty easily in fairly traditional messaging, right? This is an idea, a concept that I imagine you've seen before, maybe even written before, right? Because there's nothing inaccurate here, but it triggers really unproductive and toxic ways of imagining, conceptualizing family engagement. And when that happens, you could, in the next paragraph, talk about all the different ways engagement can happen, but in this one, you've just built that brick wall between where your audience is and where you want them to be. If instead, you can reframe this, tweak it a little, and we're going to practice some of that later, then it makes your job a lot easier to help your audiences conceptualize family engagement a little differently. So, again, the traps in public thinking. Let's pause here for questions before we dive in to finding our way out of this mess. It's a great point. So for those who didn't hear it, that part of the challenge is that the people in that tangible triad are also purveyors of that tangible triad. Like they also see it that way, that it's just teachers, parents, and students, and that's super challenging. And it is more of a demonstration that this is not about us who know everything and them who need to be educated, right? Them who need to be changed. We are all part of this culture, right? We all share in these unproductive ways of thinking, which is why I would really encourage you, with no judgment at all, to go home, go back to your offices, go back to your classrooms after this, and take a look at the stuff you've been putting out, right? Take a look at the way you talk about family engagement, because it may unwittingly be triggering some of these toxic narratives. I would almost venture to say it almost certainly is, right? Triggering at least one of these toxic narratives. Again, I work in issues, like you name the social issue, I've done work on it. The amount of time, I would say probably 95% of clients that I work with have the moment where they go, oh my God, I'm making the problem worse, right? It's not that their stuff isn't working. It's not that their messaging isn't having the intended effect. They know that to be true, it's why they hire me, right? What they don't realize is that they're actually driving audiences in the opposite direction. And that is a scary concept, that you may be doing your opposition's job for them. Other questions? Yes?
So, question, observation, one of the things that I noticed with the traditional engagement that becomes a real obstacle is we're so focused, as an educator I see it in the schools, we're so focused on how do we improve their performance on the standards, which, okay, I understand why standards exist, but that creates such a mindset where we're so focused on that when you talk to teachers who do care, they're so focused on that success that I don't have time for contacting this or engaging with this or doing that. How do we shift that if that is the target, the bullseye?
Yeah, well, you've set up the rest of our session very nicely. I mean, really, fundamentally, the way you do that, because that came up in the research too. Teachers overwhelmingly see this as an added burden on their profession, right? And, pretty justifiably. Teachers are constantly burdened with new initiatives and new things that they have to try. I'm the son of two teachers. My mom retired several years ago. She's a first grade teacher for 50 years, and she retired because she was having 20-somethings who had never set foot in a classroom, in her classroom, telling her how to teach kids to read. And she's like, okay, you know, initiative of the day, she was ready to go. But you're right. I mean, we have the idea of compartmentalized learning. We've compartmentalized the profession as well, right? If you just get kids to academic success, then we have succeeded. And part of the way we help bridge that gap is to show people how building up these social emotional skills, right, and you know, attending to a whole child can actually have those same effects also, right? You can, you know, doing that piece well can result in academic success, but that's not the whole game, right? And it's the same thing with family engagement, right? Parent-teacher conferences are great, right? You know, conversations are great. It's great to meet parents, and you can have some limited success with them, but boy, if you imagine all of the benefits outside of these narrow benefits, if we think of it in a more robust way, then we can get, you know, to a much better place. So we're going to answer that question in a much better way in the rest of the session. Yes.
So we may be getting to this also, but I have a question about audience.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that when you're trying to reframe the conversation among people who are in that triad,
yeah,
your goal is to change the way that teachers and parents and kids are thinking and acting about partnership. But when you're thinking about the broader public, it seems like it's more in the realm of focusing on public support and public investment, potentially. So I think you said earlier you're not going to focus a lot on audience, but it seems like on the face of it, like the messaging would need to be different for the two different goals.
Absolutely. The messaging will be different. The framing won't necessarily. Now I'll put it this way. So I'll spend 60 seconds on audience. When considering the audience that you're speaking to, and this, you know, this is about family engagement, about anything, right? When considering the audience that you're speaking to, that you're communicating to, you need to have an idea in mind of what you want them to do. What's the behavior change you want out of them? It could be awareness of an issue. It could be support for policy. It could be you know, to donate money to something, to volunteer their time. Whatever it is. Could, you know, for parents, it could be to show up. You know, you got to consider what it is you want them to do, right? That's your desired behavior change. Whatever that is, your audience has a natural inclination to do that thing. It's their motivation to act in the way you want them to act. And so you've got to identify what that is, right? If I want someone to donate their time, what would their motivation be to doing that? Well, the motivation would be that they care about the issue, that they want to be part of their community, that they, you know, whatever it is, right? That it makes them feel good. That it, you know, it's 3 hours they can spend away from their kids, right? That, you know, whatever it is, their natural motivations to do whatever it is I want them to do. People also have natural barriers to acting. It's why they aren't doing it now, right? So if I want people to donate money, their natural barriers may be they don't have it, right? Or they don't care about the issue enough to donate, or nobody asked them, or whatever, right? Inventory the natural barriers as well. Your job as a messenger is to double down on the motivations and dismiss or ignore the barriers, right? We get people closer to the desired behavior change if we remind them of all their natural motivations to do that thing and mitigate or ignore their barriers to do that thing. The goal is not to convince people that their barriers are wrong, right? Or that they're, you know, that they need to change their mind about them. The goal is to help them forget they're there, right? And we do that by doubling down on the motivations. And all of that can be done through framing, right? So you can do all of that and then take a look and go, okay, am I triggering those toxic mindsets? Am I triggering those, you know, those toxic cultural models? And so this framing work comes into play as well when you're adapting for audience. But it's why it's super important that as we go through this and as we, you know, give you sample messages and metaphors and values and things to inject into your messaging, it's not a script. It's not, you shouldn't cut and paste anything that's up here. Adapt it for your audiences, and that's one way to do it. Consider the desired behavior change, their motivations to act in that way, and then the barriers to doing that. Yes?
So, if you're ignoring the barriers, and it's family engagement. And the barrier is that I've got to work 2 jobs in order to get enough food in my family. That's a barrier that if you ignore, you have A, diminished me as a potential person, and B, ignored something that is not solvable in this context.
Yes, so how then can we meet that barrier without framing all of our messages around that barrier? We do it by finding different ways of engagement, right? Finding different forms of engagement that cater to someone with that barrier. And we can do that, we can amplify the different forms of engagement, and in messaging them, double down on their motivations to engage, right? So you can address the barriers through your actions. It doesn't mean that you have to focus all of your messaging around those barriers. Yes?
My question is around the succession plan. So we get a great team, we got a great director, we got a great policy committee, and then because they're so great, they get elevated, they get pulled someplace else. And then all of a sudden, all that great work, great training, or whatever you want to call it, after 2 or 3 years, right down. How do we keep the integrity of what is happening as we suffer through these changes in administrators, superintendents, assistant superintendents? Run again, what's that person, that critical glue person leaves? How do we maintain the integrity of that and keep the succession going?
So are you asking in the context of messaging? Like how do we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because it's a culture.
Yeah, it absolutely is a culture, and you just answered my question.
And then all of a sudden, somebody else comes in with a different culture, different mindset.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see we're back to ground zero, but we almost are. Restarting and ramping up, dating again, and guess what happens? Our kids fall through the cracks, our parents fall through the cracks, and it's almost like we did nothing.
Yeah, yeah. So absolutely true. And when you said the word culture, you answered your own question, right? It is about this isn't just an initiative, right? This isn't just a campaign. It is about fundamentally recreating the culture of how we think and talk about family engagement. What I tell clients when they ask about success, like how do I know this is working? You know, I work with a lot of clients that are frustrated with how the public thinks about their issue, right? You name it. You know, climate change, education, criminal justice, women's rights, you name it. They're frustrated about how the public thinks about it. And you're talking about how internally, right? How we talk about it, okay? The way you know it's working is when people who weren't a part of the research, of the effort to change the way you're talking, when people outside of that circle are communicating the way, when you start to hear it back, you start to hear your own messaging back. And so creating that culture starts with getting real consistent with doing this well and changing the way first you talk about and think and talk about family engagement, and then your colleagues, and continue to widen that circle. And as that gets more consistent, over time, people outside of that circle will start repeating it back. And that's when you've shifted the culture, right? The culture of how to think about family engagement. And then, your job gets a lot easier, right? You don't have to retrain the new superintendent or retrain the new, parents shift as well. Kids cycle out and parents as well. Yes?
So to piggyback off of what he was saying, what are the different types of forms of engagement, especially thinking about school improvement plans, right? So when we create our student engagement part of our school improvement plans, everything needs to be measurable. So we always go towards attendance, parent out, like attendance at events. So if we're thinking of parents who can't attend these events, that's not to say they're not engaged, but what are the different forms of engagement that are measurable for our district people that we could put on these school improvement plans?
I wish Vito were in the room. Is he here? So NAFSTY would answer this question a lot better than I would, but I'll give you some examples. A family and community engagement doesn't just have to be getting people to show up at an event, right? In my district where I live, we're building a new school. One of the schools needs to be replaced. We're building a new school. It's a huge process. Design it, pay for it, all that. And so our superintendent understands that there are people who can't show up to events and won't show up to events. And so one of the things that he's done is he does video conferencing, does Zoom meetings at 8 o'clock at night. I join them from my couch, right? It's a way that I can drop in. I don't have to feel motivated to say anything, to raise my hand, speak in front of, I don't even have to be dressed, right? I can just join and I feel engaged because I can, right? Engage if I choose to. Just another form of engagement. Another form of engagement is like surveys, right? It's what we call thin engagement, right? It's not super, it's as opposed to thick engagement, which is, like a room that looks like this, like, where we're encouraging people to talk to each other. But it's a form of engagement, right? So, and there are people who will participate in thin versus, versus thick. So when Vito gets back, there are a lot more, but it all goes back to the idea of thinking of engagement past parent-teacher conferences and also past the 7 p.m., beyond the bake sale, right? Past the 7 p.m. events or, these traditional forms of engagement. They exist, and frankly, you've got a resource, in this room of a lot of people who've done a lot of this.
Oh yeah. I think it's also important to say that I think that we have traps within our own teams, like we talked about being part of that triad. And when we're looking at these frameworks and these school improvement plans and district improvement plans, that the measurable item isn't always the maximum of the efforts. And that when we're moving these things and thinking of them outside of just the frame of measurable success, that the things that we are putting into measurable success would follow.
Yes, and it is not our jobs, as much as we want to convince our audiences that they're wrong about the importance of those measurable, metrics, right? A lot of people their jobs depend on those metrics. So instead of arguing the point and saying, oh, but there's things that are so much more important, instead, we can talk about all the different skills and competencies that robust family engagement can affect in our kids, and how that has a connection to the measurable metrics, right? That we can build all these other things, and yes, if you're focused on SAT scores or the standardized test scores, then it's going to do all these other great things too, and it's going to positively affect that. So it's there's a ton of examples of how that works, but it starts with the idea that our job is not to convince people that they're wrong, and it is always our instinct as advocates to do that, right? To convince people. Okay, last one, and then we need to move on.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you for taking my question. Okay, how do you impress upon your district that family engagement should be, one, measurable, and two, how do you handle the culture that wants things to remain a status quo?
Yeah, hopefully that's a loaded question. So I will answer it this way, because it could be a long answer. I'll answer it this way. You start small. We heard it on the panel first, right? Start small. Start with how you talk about family engagement. Use examples of how it could be measured, how it has been measured, right? Use examples of that measurement. How it's, you can say the same thing about policies, right? Use examples of policies, structures, practices that have been successful elsewhere, right? And how not just that they have led to certain outcomes, but how they have led to those outcomes, how that system of success has worked. And keep doing it over and over and over again, and that's how you change. When we talk about changing public narrative, we're talking about shifting the culture. That's the same thing. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Marisa, our researcher, Marisa, PhD, who will walk through some of the research before lunch, and then the rest of it after.
I think that to start with, I hope everybody's taken away from what Shaun was talking about, that we used to think in communications that any story would work. If it sounded good to us, it's going to work for the public. But when you apply cultural models theory, when you understand how the human brain works, you realize that actually you need to be really attendant to the stories that you're creating and understand how they're going to activate those different ways of thinking. So I'm going to talk about the sort of overarching strategies and the parts of that strategy that helps you tell a new story about engagement that is going to activate those more positive ways of thinking about engagement and get people closer to where you want them to go, and hopefully all the way to where you want them to go if everybody is using the same strategy in consistent but also flexible ways sort of across all of your communications in all the different places in which you communicate. So the overarching strategy is creating conditions for engagement. So as you probably saw from the things that Shaun showed, is people don't really think about there being a system or specific conditions for engagement. It's very individualized, right? It's about caring. It's about some parents and some communities don't care. But people have a hard time thinking about the fact that actually there are specific conditions that make it easier or harder to engage, and that we can change those conditions, that we can actually create situations in schools, out of schools, at the district level, at the state level, that make it easier for all families, all communities, all schools to engage in really effective ways. So the sort of strands of this reframing strategy are, first, orienting people towards equity, which is such an important part of what this work is. And I'm going to talk more about that. Explaining specifically the context for engagement. Again, people are stuck in this sort of tangible triad, caring trap that we need to push people out of. And also talking about the transformative power of engagement. So people think, oh, engagement's it's a nice add-on, right? But does it really change the way my child is being educated and how well they do? And we have created frames that help people think about that, how it can actually transform things, not just for students, but also for schools and teachers and for families as well, and how to most effectively communicate about that. So I'm going to start with talking about the values that we recommend within this strategy. So what do we mean by values? So values are sort of enduring beliefs about who we are, both individually and as a society. So they're things that we believe about ourselves, that we believe we really care about, things like fairness or justice or human potential. And what they do is they help orient people's attitude towards a particular topic. So I care about engagement because it's really about X. So one of the most important things for this work is figuring out what is the value that answers that question about why does this matter? Why would I even, get involved with family engagement? So we actually found two different values that worked. And the first one is the idea of interdependence. So this idea that all of us rely on one another for student success and to benefit all of us. And what was really interesting in this one is we found this worked really well with education practitioners. So more so than it did with the public, although it does also work fairly well with the public as well. But I think one barrier that I'm sure all of you have heard is, well, I have enough on my plate. Why would I add engagement? This is just more work for me. But interdependence actually moves practitioners thinking past that. The story that you're telling to educators is that we all rely on one another. So we all have a stake in the success of children in our schools and in the success of the school and of families more generally. So what this is doing is it's moving practitioners away from that tangible triad, right? It's not just the teachers and the students and the schools that help them think about community members, about other people in the education system. It moved people past this idea, practitioners past this idea that there are certain communities that are just unsafe. This is very culture of poverty and unsafe communities are very loaded terms. People don't want to talk about race, so they talk about certain communities and certain and poverty instead. But that's really what they're talking about. It kind of moves, talking about interdependence and the fact that we all rely on one another helps practitioners move past that very negative thinking and a very fatalistic thinking of, oh, well, this is extra work for me. I'm still going to be going it alone, and it's not going to work. I have enough. If you remember, Shaun pointed to that cultural model of schools or families. This was a cultural model that we really found amongst practitioners when we interviewed them at the beginning of this project, where practitioners do, and there are practitioners in this room, so hopefully you will confirm this, do think of their schools as families, right? Like we're all in this together, and there might actually be room for the parents to be part of this family. Actually, maybe communities can be part of this family that we have in our school. So when you use the value of interdependence, it cues that way of thinking, that we're all working together, that we're all in this together. And it's not just that I'm doing all the work, it's that they're going to be supporting me as well. So this particular value is really useful for when you're communicating with practitioners. So the second value that we recommend is the value of opportunity for all. And this, this communicates to members of the public in a powerful way, and I'm going to show you actually some data on this, that inclusiveness is really key to having effective engagement, and that's why engagement is so important. And it also opens up those discussions about equity that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to talk about actually putting these equity and opportunity for all together in a moment. But just to give you an example, and again, as Shaun said, this isn't a script. This is just one example of how you can use this value. We're committed to making sure that all people have opportunities, regardless of the color of their skin, how much money their family has, or the language they speak at home. And that's why we need to build these strong connections between all families, our schools, and our communities. So even just using the words opportunity and all really pushes people in the direction that you want to. And it's because it overcomes this sense of fatalism about some families aren't going to engage in engagement, and moves people more towards a sense of collective responsibility and collective benefits, and especially the importance of equity. So let me show you just how powerful this was. This is the result of the survey experiment that we did with about, it was a little bit more than 5,000 participants, where we showed people a number of frames and then asked them a number of questions to see, how their answers differed from this black line, which is the control group who didn't get any frames. And as you can see, the yellow one, which is opportunity for all, really did amazingly well compared to the other values that we tested. It significantly increased support for policies. It shot up perceived importance of engagement, which is what we want values to do. They sort of bring people into why is this so important for me. And also, I think this is really interesting. So collective ability to enact change. So the sense that we can do this, which, people might say, oh yeah, this is important, but I don't think it's actually going to happen. When you have a value that makes people think we could actually do this, that's really powerful. So we're going to do our first exercise. Shaun, I don't know if you wanted to take over this or, no, I can go ahead? Okay. So we're going to take the opportunity for all value and actually try using it right now. Again, you can be creative with it, but I'm going to ask you all individually to write a short letter to the editor of your local newspaper. And what you're doing is explaining why strong family-school engagement is something that everyone in your community should expect from its schools. So I just want you to write a couple of sentences, but think about how you would use that opportunity for all, that idea that everyone deserves the opportunity to engage in their schools, and everyone deserves the opportunity to do well via this engagement, for trying to convince people in your community why it's so important. So I'll give you 5 minutes, about 5 minutes to write. And then I'll just ask a few people to share out and let me know what they wrote. So it just needs to be a sentence or two. Oh, Shaun's gonna bring a microphone over so we can all hear you.
to ensure that we do provide an opportunity for all to succeed, we need an education system that is built on a strong network of interdependencies. We need teachers, we need administrators, we need families, and we need community.
Perfect. I love that. And you went after the whole public and the practitioners in that one, which was fantastic. Yeah.
The interdependence of schools and families brings about the opportunity for all kids to have robust experiences in their communities. By working together as a collective whole, our children will develop empathetic, inclusive values to last their lifetime.
Love that. Yeah, that was really good. Yeah, I think so. Since we're getting close to lunch, we're going to go ahead. But I just want to say, like, just with those two examples, the ways you used both of those values were very different, right? But you both used them. Like, you weren't stuck to a script. And I think the wonderful thing to remember about values also is that we often recommend leading in with them because they're that hook that brings people in, like, oh, I should care about this thing because I value opportunity for all, or I value interdependence. But you can also sprinkle those values throughout your communications. It doesn't have to just be used at the beginning, but you can also use different versions of it, like inclusiveness, in a different part of whatever you're communicating, in addition to opportunity or something like that. So again, feel free to be creative on that one. So what I'm going to do is just show you one more of the frames, even though I have a number of them, but one that connects particularly to opportunity for all when we talk about that strand about orienting people towards equity. And then we'll break for lunch, and then I'm going to get into our metaphor, which is really a lot of fun. So I hope everybody sticks around to learn more about the metaphor. But first, let's get into equity. I'm going in the wrong direction. Sorry about that. There we go. So another thing that we tend to find is that examples, which, while this might seem very obvious, are often very powerful, and we often forget to actually use them. Because when you're working in a world that you are extremely embedded in, where you're talking to other people all the time about the same work, you've kind of, I know I do this, sort of forget that everybody else doesn't have your knowledge. So one of the things that we found, we realized that we really needed to find a way of talking about equity because it's a key part of this work. It's really important in education, and it's often used, equitable practices, sort of in a vacuum in communications. And we know that the American public really doesn't understand what equity is and how it's different from equality. So we tried a few different ways to get to explaining equity, and actually it turns out, it actually turns out that it's really simple. You just explain what it is. You just tell people there are barriers to access for people, and here are the solutions. And if you can be as specific as possible, that actually increases, I didn't bring the graph for this one, but it really increases support for equitable practices. And as I said, this seems really obvious, but looking through a lot of different websites around engagement, it was amazing how often the words equity and equitable practices came up just with no description of what people are talking about. So this is an easy one for you all to start using. So I just gave you a couple of examples that are, the first one is something that you might see in like a school newsletter or something like that, that is giving good information. We're offering extended hours and additional locations for parent-teacher conferences. And for people who need those things, they might be really appreciative, but you're missing an opportunity to educate everybody in your school community about why these things are necessary. So, just giving a little bit more information about the fact that, there are are parents in your school who have varied work schedules, they have childcare needs, they might be working multiple jobs or just have no leave from school. They need the extended hours and locations. And that's a really great way to educate your school community about what equity is and how you address equity. And the second one is very similar, but it's about making sure that all school materials are translated. And why that needs to happen. Our community includes speakers of many different languages, and therefore all school materials are going to be provided this way. And I think, we do know that the thing about this one that I think is maybe particularly important is that I think we're all aware that there are questions amongst some people about why do we need translated materials? Why don't people know how to speak English? So giving some people some sort of explanation about why this is necessary, maybe more, this is sort of a positive spin on it, I guess you could say. It includes speakers of many different languages. You could say we have students from across the globe, just to kind of push people towards thinking, oh yeah, this is something that is important in our school and a way for everybody in our school to be engaged. So I think that putting opportunity for all together with equity is really powerful and sort of doubles the power of those two frames, and really orients people towards equity. So this is just an example that I created as a NAFSCI tweet. I sort of shamelessly stole their Twitter account, and none of these are, well, they're all real people, but I also shamelessly stole it from Twitter, where you lead in again with talking about how all kids need the opportunity to succeed, and that there are engagement practices that, and actually, sorry, this is in the wrong spot, but there are barriers that families face. So we need to make sure that all children can reach their goals. So you can frame in a tweet. You can use 2 frames in a tweet. It doesn't have to be something where you're writing out an entire page of communication. And this is something that you could also say to somebody relatively easily as well. So I'm really excited to get in the metaphor, but I know you also need to eat, and probably I do too. So why don't we break for lunch?